Hey there, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a pretty controversial theory, one that totally reframes the current tensions we see with Russia. The basic idea? What we're witnessing today isn't just something that popped up recently. No. According to the source, it's actually the final move in a game that's been playing out for decades, a kind of hidden agenda.
So on one side, you've got the story most of us are familiar with, right? That all this tension is basically down to Russian aggression. But the source material we're looking at today paints a completely different picture. It argues these tensions are no accident. They're the calculated result of a long-term plan from the West. So, yeah, let's dive into that alternative story and see what it's all about.
All right, so you can see we've got these two competing narratives, and in this explainer, we're really going to unpack that second one. The idea that the West's relationship with Russia hasn't just been a series of reactions, but a deliberate, long-term project.
And this is really the heart of the claim from our source. It says, look, what you're seeing play out on the world stage, it's not just chaos. It's not a bunch of mistakes. It is the final act of a play, and the script for that play was written a long, long time ago.
Okay, so if there's a grand plan, you've got to ask, who's the architect? Well, our source points a finger at one specific person and one specific book as the starting point for this whole strategy.
And that man is Brzezinski. Now, if you follow foreign policy, you know that name. He was a giant in the field, served as national security advisor to President Carter, and according to the source we're looking at, you just can't grasp this supposed hidden agenda without first understanding him and his ideas.
Brzezinski laid this all out in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. Think of it like this. He saw the entire Eurasian landmass, that's Europe and Asia, as a giant chessboard, and his theory was simple but, incredibly ambitious. Whoever controls that chessboard controls the world. So for America to remain the top dog, it needed to manage all the key players on that board. And guess which piece was the most powerful one to control? Yep, Russia.
And this is where the source says the plan gets really, really assertive. It wasn't about creating a partnership, it was more of a demand. Russia was just expected to deal with it, to accept that NATO and Europe were going to expand right up to its borders. It wasn't a negotiation. There was no if about it, only when.
Okay, hold on, because this is where the theory gets really radical. According to our source, Brzezinski's vision wasn't just about containing Russia. Nope. It claims the plan was much more aggressive, a strategy of subjugation and maybe even the literal dismantling of the Russian state itself.
So let's be super clear on this, because it's a huge claim. The source is saying the end game was never just about keeping Russia in check. The ultimate goal was to weaken it so much that it could actually be partitioned, broken up into smaller pieces. Why? To make sure it could never, ever again challenge U.S. dominance on that grand chessboard.
And this wasn't just some vague concept, according to the source. It claims Brzezinski had a new map in mind. He literally envisioned Russia being carved up into three separate entities. You'd have a European Russia oriented towards the west, then a Siberian Republic in the middle with all its resources, and finally a Far Eastern Republic looking out towards Asia. So one massive country split into three.
All right, so a theory in a book from the 90s, that's one thing, right? But what our source does next is try to connect the dots. It looks at major historical events over the last few decades and argues they weren't random at all. Instead, they were deliberate, calculated moves, all part of executing this plan.
So according to the source, here's how the agenda allegedly played out on the timeline. It starts with the slow, steady crawl of NATO eastward, which from this perspective looks a lot like strategic encirclement. Then you have the 1999 bombing of Serbia. In this view, that was a signal. Hey, Russia, your allies, they're fair game. Fast forward to 2002, the U.S. ditches the ABM treaty, basically taking the guardrails off military escalation. And then, the big one, 2014. The Maidan events in Ukraine, which, from this point of view, yanked it critical buffer state right into the Western sphere of influence.
And the source claims this pattern of pressure didn't stop. It points to two specific moments where it says peace was deliberately scuttled. First, the collapse of the Minsk II Accords, and then a potential peace deal in April 2022 that was supposedly blocked. The argument here is that these weren't just diplomatic failures. They were intentional moves designed to keep the conflict going, to bleed Russia even more.
All right, so if Brzezinski was the architect back in the 90s,
who's supposedly running the show today? Well, the source doesn't point to any one person. Instead, it points to powerful, permanent institutions and some surprisingly recent documents.
So according to this theory, the plan isn't being driven by presidents who, change every 4 or 8 years. It's supposedly being pushed forward by the permanent players in Washington. We're talking about what the source calls the deep state bureaucracy, the military-industrial complex, which has an interesting conflict, and intelligence agencies like the CIA. The thinking is that these groups are the ones who can provide the decades-long continuity needed for a strategy like this.
And if you're looking for modern evidence, the source points directly to this, a 2019 study from the highly influential RAND Corporation. The title? Extending Russia. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a strategic blueprint on how to overextend and unbalance Russia. For the author of our source material, this is basically the smoking gun. It's proof that Brzezinski's grand chessboard thinking is still very much alive and kicking.
So there you have it. That is the theory in a nutshell. It paints a picture of our world that isn't shaped by random events and reactions, but by a hidden long-term design. Now, whether you look at all this and see a compelling explanation or just a giant conspiracy theory, it definitely forces you to ask a pretty fundamental question about power and history. How much of what happens in the world is just what happens? And how much of it was planned to happen all along?